Welcome to Security Architecture Podcast, where we help cybersecurity professionals to stay ahead of the curve and ensure they are successful in their cybersecurity journey.
Hi, I'm Evgeny.
Hi, I'm Dimitri.
We have a pleasure today to talk to Nick from Menlo. Nick, can you please introduce yourself and the company?
Sure. Hi, I'm Nick Edwards. I'm the Vice President of Product Management at Menlo Security. And we are a security vendor who provides services for customers who are looking to improve their security outcomes and keep their end users safe, as well as go through the journey of digital transformation. So happy to be here. Really big fan of your podcast, and I'm happy to chat about browser isolation.
Excellent. So Nick, what's the name of the offering or part of the product that addressing the browser isolation by Menlo?
I think our approach to isolation is a little bit different from probably a lot of the other vendors you might have on your show. We believe that isolation provides a lot of different capabilities to improve customer security outcomes. So it's essentially the core of our architecture that applies to different products in our portfolio. So we have one product that is pure remote browser isolation, and we call that the Secure Internet product. We also have our Secure Gateway, which is our cloud proxy that has isolation baked into its functionality. So capabilities like Cosby and a variety of other file control capabilities that are traditionally associated with secure gateways are also able to capitalize on isolation. And then thirdly, our private access solution, which is frequently deployed for customers who are along the zero trust network access journey, also uses browser isolation in kind of a classic reverse mode, allowing users to access web apps securely going through an isolation layer. So it's three products at core that apply this core technology to its security profile.
Great, Nick. You may be surprised, but we are focused about architecture. So we definitely want to dive in and understand the architecture. So maybe you can show some slides or walk us through the component.
Sure. Yeah, why don't I go ahead and share my screen? I'll give you some slides to just frame kind of our product offering through the lens of architecture. So as I mentioned, at the core of what we do is isolation. And that applies to a lot of different capabilities. Some of them are mentioned here, our Secure Gateway, our Zero Trust Private Access Solution, Cosby, and so forth. And it's offered via a cloud framework to allow users, whether at the branch office, at home, at a coffee shop, to access both private applications and kind of web SaaS applications that might traditionally be available. From an architectural point of view, our overall notion is that first we have to ingest users to the platform. And once they're kind of funneled and steered to our platform via a variety of ways, whether they're coming from a traditional pack file, from an agent, from kind of SD-WANs and so forth, it hits our enforcement layer. And as you can see here, it will go through either our secure gateway functionality or our broader kind of Cosby and private access to control what applications they're accessing. And then beyond that, it goes through a very comprehensive security stack that includes things like data loss prevention and isolation and the broader range of content inspection services. But I think when we think about our architecture, it kind of goes through two different approaches. One is effectively our cloud infrastructure itself. And for that, we have cloud services that is a mix of public cloud services like AWS, as well as other regional providers around the world. And we have roughly 95 or so points of presence that gives us the global reach that we're looking for. And that architecture is designed to give elasticity and very high scalability for users as they kind of ramp up or ramp down their usage, as well as the broad geographic reach, but also flexibility. A lot of our customers might have very unique use cases for different geographical pockets around the world. They want to have clean IPs as they egress through the network. They want to have static IPs for different applications that rely upon IP-based authentication. And also some customers might have different regions where they need to have localized content. So you need to have a very flexible and scalable cloud architecture to allow users to ingress from wherever they are in the world and then egress in a way that makes sense for their business needs. And then when you think about the architecture from an application perspective, we have basically our cloud service that has a container. Consider it a kind of a clean sandbox where these isolated sessions from a browser point of view occur. And these isolated sessions occur on a per browser basis. So you might have 3 different browsers running with 20 different tabs. We can support that because we can support that at scale. And each browser session has a unique set of resources allocated for that browser instance to allow you to run different applications in the browser, full scalability, full functionality for the browser itself. So one thing that's unique about our architecture is that we're not just doing pixel streaming. When you think about legacy VDI implementations, they weren't that great. You try to move the mouse and then you'd have to go make an espresso while you waited for the browser to keep up with you. But our approach is very different. We're basically using some very intelligent ways to mirror what we see in our browser down to the end user's browser, using inherent browser functionality, such as the DOM, for example. So there's no notion of just streaming pixels. We are replicating the DOM structure between our browser and the user's browser, and that gives some of this robust functionality, such as the right-click menus. If you look at a lot of other browser isolation technologies, if you right-click, those vendors are giving you their interpretation of what that right-click should be. But the problem is users want to have the full functionality. They may not be as sophisticated as a lot of the more long-tenured IT people. So they're going to see that and they're going to wonder, hey, what's wrong with my kind of web experience? When you think about browsers in the lens of security, customers want to have the maximum security outcomes without disrupting their business operations. And browsers are where work happens. 75% of all work goes through the browser, whether that's through a web conference or just going to a SaaS application. And that means that if you're disrupting the user experience, then the IT help desk is going to flood and people are going to ask questions. So we've done our maximum to give a native browsing experience to the users so that they're not asking questions, they're not flooding the help desk with concerns and questions, while allowing the IT staff to deliver the maximum security outcome. And that's all predicated based off of a scalable cloud infrastructure with a very thoughtful implementation using containers and kind of these sandboxes that control the browser itself in its remote state.
Nick, you mentioned several browsers, and you mentioned you have quite a big presence in the cloud. But how do you actually route the traffic from the user or from the office towards your cloud?
So we have a lot of different ways for customers to send their traffic to our cloud. And it really depends on where they are with their own network transformation journey. At the most basic level, we can do things like proxy chain in a sense, or effectively where there's an upstream device. It could be a proxy, it could be a firewall. And based off of whatever rules they have, they just send us traffic. And that's very simple. And we take that traffic and we can apply whatever policy they have in mind. We also have customers who are a step further. They may want to use the pack file, for example, on their browser on their kind of endpoint to route traffic to us. And we have a lot of customers who are using us in that mode. And we also have customers who have SD-WAN products kind of upstream. You're probably familiar with the broader SASE initiatives, and they want to send us traffic in that way. And in those cases, we can use IPsec tunnels, for example, to connect the endpoints of the SD-WAN or the firewall in that case to our cloud platform, being terminated at kind of one of our multi-tenant VPN gateways. So we have a lot of different options for customers to send us traffic. But I think one thing that's built into our architecture is it's not only multi-tenant, but also gives customers the ability to craft their own multi-tenancy in a sense. One of our big customers is the Department of Defense in the United States. So we have a broad range of different services, Navy, Army, et cetera, who are using our service. And they might have unique security requirements that they need to implement from a policy point of view. But at the same time, the DoD has a broader range of security policies that they want to make sure that every organization adheres to. So our architecture supports this model where they can have one policy kind of at the blanket level for everyone, and then they can delegate for each domain or each set of organizations a unique kind of set of policy frameworks that they can apply. So those individual groups will inherit the macro policy while still being able to fine tune based off of their own needs. So all that is baked into our architectural approach, regardless of where the traffic is coming from and regardless of kind of what organization or where the traffic is going to.
Nick, as we learned as part of our discussion with Chase, Dr. Zero Trust, it's very important to stay below 250 millisecond response time. It sounds like your solution transcribes the data that it gets and forwards to the browser for rendering.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Latency is a key factor. And we see this in all of proof of concepts, proof of values that our customers deploy. They want to say, hey, look, if I deploy this, will I disrupt our end users' browsing experience. And it's hard to solve this problem. We've been doing this for 10 years, so we have solved it. So I'm very proud of what we've done. We have a lot of intellectual capital built up into this. And I'll kind of give you just a basic high-level view of how this might work. So when you log in as a user, you authenticate, and that means that your PAC file has directed you to our service as the first hop to apply policies. Once the user does that, we're using whatever authentication system they may have based off of their SSO policies and so forth. When that happens, we basically kind of register that user as kind of an isolated session in this example. Essentially, we mirror the DOM from the remote browser to the end user's browser, which is a much more efficient way of using network bandwidth and providing web traffic to the user. So what that means is we see the user request a certain capability or a certain resource on the web. Instead of just drawing the pixels basically twice, we're essentially telling the browser on the endpoint what our DOM is at the cloud level and directing that end user's DOM to recreate that traffic and recreate those images or content. And so what this means is it's a much more efficient use of bandwidth. And we typically see in a lot of cases users' bandwidth requirements decline because we have a much more compact and streamed protocol for doing some of these things. And so typically most of our customers see latency far less than 100 milliseconds, and that's one of our design goals.
Nice. In such case, what about single page applications? Because they're running JavaScript in the remote browser and they continuously modifying the DOM elements. How is this handled by your solution?
Yeah, so in these SPA type of examples, it actually is a very elegant use of isolation. So when users go to these websites, since they are typically being proxied through Menlo's platform, we see everything in our remote browser. And so we are able to do these types of use cases for the user in a way that is very native to them. If you were just a traditional secure gateway, some of these mouse movements, for example, or whatever, might require a separate network call, and that would introduce even more latency or whatever it might be. We are seeing all of that in our isolated browser. So what that means is as the user moves the mouse or requests a certain piece of functionality, they don't need to do a network round trip to the end destination server. All they're doing is going to our cloud server, basically our isolation in our container, and then we are seeing that responsiveness, and then we are delivering that to the user. So traditionally, it's a much superior outcome than even a traditional secure gateway in that case.
Nick, you mentioned integration with IAM and user authentication. Can you explain a bit more further how it's done?
Sure. So effectively, when a user sets up our system and an admin, they would there's a configuration page where they would point to their own IAM, their own identity management platform, their IDP. And so we traditionally support, obviously, SAML 2.0 with the broad range of Azure, Okta, on-prem, ADFS, et cetera, one login and this kind of thing. And from this, we can get user and group data to apply policies. And that's the way a lot of our customers think about it. We also do have the ability to take in users' kind of more traditional model of user management. If they just want to upload a file of 20,000 users in their groups, we can take that in natively. But most of our customers are using more of the advanced single sign-on functionality. And so we want to make sure we can integrate with all those different providers.
Very interesting. Tell us, please, how would your technology integrate with existing Secure Web Gateway or Ztna or Cosby solutions? I understand that you have your own offerings on this front, but how would it work if the customer has someone else's technology for this functionality?
Yeah, traditionally, in these cases, what we typically see is a customer who is reviewing the current threat landscape, and their perspective is, wow, I have this legacy proxy that's been in my network forever. It might be a blue coat, for example, and they want to provide more contemporary capabilities. So in that case, how do they use isolation in conjunction with something like a blue coat? Well, what they traditionally might do is, and we see them start out in this path, is they would say, send the uncategorized traffic to Menlo to provide for isolation. And that's a simple forwarding rule in their proxy. It's pretty straightforward. Basically, if this, then that, and then these types of URLs get sent to Menlo, and we can provide isolation for that. And a similar model can be used for firewalls, whether that's kind of an on-prem or a cloud firewall. And we see a lot of customers who've actually made the leap for cloud secured gateways, and they're dissatisfied. but they realize it might take time to rip and replace their existing cloud security gateway. So they'll augment that with our isolation. And so in those cases, again, it's a relatively simple and straightforward rule set based off of category typically, and then they would forward that to kind of our platform. But what we see over time is that customers realize that, wow, this works really well for these websites in terms of isolation. And based off the data that we see, over the past several years, it's been roughly a 10x increase in attacks coming from URLs that are not just uncategorized. We're talking about URLs that were good at one point and they're classified as good, but suddenly they're delivering malware. They're the source of phishing attacks. And there's obviously a ton of research that's available on understanding this broader range of attacks that are coming from websites that are traditionally known as good. So in those cases, customers will typically expand the types of URLs, the categories that they're sending to Menlo. So it's not just uncategorized. It might start there, then it'll go to news and media, sports, gambling, and everything else. And for a lot of customers, we end up seeing all of their categories, not just uncategorized. And I think this dovetails nicely into where customers are from their own view of the marketplace. They realize that if they want to improve the security outcomes, they can't do what they've always been doing. So how can they leverage new technologies like isolation to do that? Well, they can start by sending some traffic and then more and more as they get more comfortable with the different security outcomes they're getting and the usability impact. And it's very simple using traditional network technologies to do that, typically just a forwarding rule in their proxy or firewall.
Nick, so you mentioned if I use Menlo with conjunction with somebody else, I may decide all categories, uncategorized traffic, and I understand this. But what if I use Menlo only? Would you do browser search for everything? Because from what I know, it's quite resource intense.
Yeah, so that's probably a good segue for me. Why don't I go to the admin UI of our product so you can get a sense of what some of the capabilities are in the product. And I think you're absolutely right that, historically, this has been a very compute intensive problem space for the vendor community. And I think for us, obviously, the advent of cloud computing has been a very huge benefit for companies like ours who want to do great things and be very ambitious with our vision and kind of leverage the capabilities and the technology curves that are provided via the cloud. So what we're looking at here is the admin portal for our products. And just to give you a sense, in this upper right-hand corner here, you can see all the different capabilities that we have to offer from not only kind of our web security policy perspective, email policy and DLP policy, but also private access. And for our product, we have built isolation into this from the ground up from the beginning. We have not acquired our isolation technology. We have not acquired our private access technology. So this is all built into the product natively. And so that means that you don't have to log into different portals to configure isolation here and then configure web security here and make sure those two things are connected. It's all available in one admin UI for policy and one admin UI for reporting and logging. So what we're looking at here is the web policy frameworks. So in this particular example, you can apply isolation to any categories that are in the threat that you want. Obviously, you can isolate, block, or allow, or use isolate read-only, which will basically render that page in a read-only type of model. So the users can't input anything. For example, if it were a phishing attack, they wouldn't be able to input their credentials, they would be safe. But we also allow this type of functionality across the broader range of categories, as you mentioned. So we have 80, 90 some odd different categories here. And again, customers who pay for this option can provide isolation to all these as they see fit. And for us, building in a kind of a scalable cloud framework means that the customers don't have to deploy additional hardware necessarily to take advantage of these capabilities. They just get this basically for free using our cloud service. And it kind of enables them to be safe as they use this product across a wider range of capabilities for their end users.
Nice, and thank you for sharing how the product works.
Yeah, there's probably some other things that are worth mentioning here. As we talk about isolation, I think if I want your listeners to take away anything from this session, it's that if you're interested in applying the maximum benefits of isolation, you really need to apply it as broadly as possible. So it's not just categories of URLs, it's also things like file types and documents. So for example, we give customers the ability to apply isolation to files. And so what that would mean is you could have documents that are rendered in isolation instead of having them delivered to their end user. And that also means that you can apply all the content inspection capabilities to the documents that are being rendered in isolation. There might be cases where your users say, hey, look, I really need to access this document and I don't want to be impeded by any security solution. Well, we can give administrators the ability to say, hey, if it's a CAD drawing or something that's very sensitive, we're going to first render that in isolation. And then if you want to download it, we're going to make sure that it is scanned for viruses, run it through the cloud sandbox and make sure it's safe before you can do that. And that's something that's available here. And we can have that on a very granular basis across a wide range of file types. Now, obviously, for some of these file types, they may not be renderable in isolation, but for some, you can at least have the ability to block or treat them, as appropriate. And the same thing goes for other applications of isolation that are beyond the security domain. When we think about the cloud, and I hope users think about this in a similar vein, think about the cloud as not just a new form factor, right? That's old news. We've been racking and stacking boxes in clouds for a decade now in the security industry. We need to reimagine certain use cases. So one use case that we have a lot of our customers using is one where we can apply isolation to more intelligent use of bandwidth. So think about this. If you have all of your users in your network streaming YouTube, listening to music, maybe they have YouTube on in the background because they're listening to the content of a sporting event, or maybe the jury verdict for the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, for example. Well, that's just taking up bandwidth. And obviously we have bandwidth quotas. That's been around for a long time. But what we have also is the ability to do something like this, where you can say, hey, for these users or groups, you can specify, you can decide that I want to have video settings configured based off of what websites they're going to. For example, for YouTube, instead of giving them maximum resolution, you can degrade that resolution, and then you can have them have even a different resolution on the background tab if that's not the foreground tab. And so all this allows for this more intelligent use of kind of internet technologies in a way that doesn't sacrifice security, but also kind of protects and secures the bandwidth in a way that is more efficient for our users. And that's something that the isolation layer allows customers to take advantage of.
Is this more secure web gateway like QoS, or it's more technologies isolation related, I'm wondering?
Well, I think you could try to do this with QoS at some other network stack, for example. Most web proxies will just give you the ability to say, hey, here's your bandwidth quota. You max this out, you're done for the day. But what isolation allows you to do is to kind of basically configure the resolution at the isolation layer in our surrogate browser. And so this is very much kind of an isolation-centric technology that kind of augments legacy secure gateway technology from a browser kind of bandwidth quota perspective. You could try to do this on a network device, but those network devices may not have kind of as detailed capabilities, such as saying, hey, if it's the active tabs, the marketing team or the creative team of some different agency, they want to have maximum resolution. We can do that. But if it's a background tab and it may not be as relevant, kind of degrade the resolution as needed. And those are capabilities that network devices from a QoS perspective really won't be able to address.
Nick, so we talk about the web access. Let's talk a little bit about isolation for internal web-based resources. As example, if you're running internally some old legacy application that supports Internet Explorer 8 or around it, how would the solution handle that?
Yeah, for our private access solution offers this ability to basically access private applications without the use of installing a client agent, like a lot of Ztna solutions. So this works really well for the use case you described that are web app centric. Now, they would go through the product. If you've ever kind of logged into an Okta tile board, they would authenticate, and then they would have provisioned the applications that they have enabled to them from a business perspective. And so they could click on that tile, and then they would be routed through our isolation layer to that application. So our isolation layer has the ability to configure which browsers can be supported for different applications. And obviously a lot of customers want to have maximum kind of up-to-date standards as much as possible. So we don't see a lot of IE8, but for example, IE11 is a case where it's going to be end of life by Microsoft shortly. I mean, we're going to have to support that for an extended period because we have government agencies and some groups that have applications that require that, similar to what you're referring to for IE8. So there is a point where we no longer support kind of updates to legacy browsers like older versions of IE, but a lot of the functionality will work. It really depends on a case-by-case basis of the application, what the browser functionality they're using is. I mean, I think as you go further and further back, probably the user experience degrades depending upon what the application is. But for the most part, I think the last time we checked, IE11, for example, is being used by less than 1% of our user base. And so even for something like that, we support just as well as we support the latest versions of Chrome and other types of browsers.
Nick, as you mentioned, a lot of people work in a browser, but they also edit documents in the browser, Office 365, Google Docs. How is it done with browser isolation?
Yeah, so we can render documents in browser safely, and we give the users the ability to download those. Now, depending upon the document type, we might have more or less capabilities in terms of editing and kind of modifying them in the browser. We can do things, for example, with Google Docs that is pretty effective, but a lot of kind of documents you might require further download if you want to have the maximum functionality. Obviously, things like the spreadsheets are pretty sophisticated, and there's a lot of browser functionality in there. So for some of the more sophisticated document manipulation use cases, we advise customers just to download it natively, but at least they'll be able to download it securely because it's going through our entire and comprehensive security stack.
Nice. So how your solution addresses the BYOD devices? As example, mobile devices that employees might be bringing to work and trying to consume emails or documents through it.
Yeah, so it's a good question. We obviously see a lot of mobile devices and tablets, and after the pandemic with COVID, we saw that spike because executives who are typically more tablet-based are working remotely at home. So one of the things that we've done that I think is very unique to our implementation is we have a full version of kind of the mobile Chromium backend for browser isolation. It's a very different technology because obviously you're doing things like pinches and zooms and all those sorts of things with isolation coming through a mobile device. And we have full support for that. So a user, whether they're accessing kind of internet traffic externally or whether they're accessing private applications, we support that use case with full mobile functionality, zooms, pinches, and taps very much natively. And in some cases, obviously customers might need to have MDM in to kind of control those devices, or in some cases, if they want to have more pure BYOD access from anywhere, then they're going to have to use more advanced functionality with respect to applying policies of where they're coming from, making sure there are certain restrictions upon the SaaS app they may be accessing and so forth.
What about extensions? We all have some kind of WebEx extension, LastPass extension, and many, many others. Is it compatible with browser isolation?
Yes, for our implementation, it is. And that's because we've retained most of the native browser functionality via the DOM mirroring and the DOM tree and this sort of thing. If you're just doing pixel streaming, obviously you're going to have some challenges because the plugins don't know what they need to talk to activate the functionality. But since we're retaining the DOM tree and the bulk of the website functionality or the browser functionality, then most of the commonly used extensions will work just fine. So like LastPass and OneLogin, those are the most common ones we see. We use those internally and those work just fine. Where it might get a little bit more complicated is if someone is doing ad blockers. And that's because when we're delivering resources to the end user's browser, we're rewriting those. We are transforming them. So instead of getting the original image file, we're transforming that image and delivering that to the user in some cases. So for certain ad blockers, it may not work as well, but for the vast majority of kind of enterprise grade functionality for browser extensions, they should work just as they would if they're working outside of isolation.
So Nick, how the organization can actually get some reporting of attacks that prevented by the technology?
Yeah, so why don't I dive back into the UI here so you can kind of get that sense here. You can get a read for what the reporting capabilities are for our administrators. So here we go. All right, so I'll go to the dashboard view here. Now, the dashboard view is kind of where most administrators start, and this is from my own private tenant. I do a lot of demoing and testing through this. And this is some of my web traffic over the past 24 hours. And the administrators can kind of get a breakdown at the overview level of who the users were, what threat types are seeing, what are the domains, and so forth. And then they can kind of dive even deeper to go for more specifics around the documents they're accessing, the types of services, and who's being profiled from a security point of view, and so forth. But we also offer, in what we call our Insights module, kind of a very detailed breakdown of user traffic and user behavior. So admins can basically pivot on different technology and different use cases that the users might see. So in this particular example, if I go to this event, you can drill down, you can see all the log data. It's very rich. You can see what someone did. You can see where they're visiting in this particular web page, and you can pivot on a per user basis to see other things. So a lot of this capability from a reporting and UI dashboarding perspective is baked into the product. It's also available via our API. A lot of our customers are using some other platform for collecting data, SIM, maybe it's Splunk, for example. So if you go to Splunk base, you'll have a technology add-on that will allow customers to elegantly take our traffic from a logging and reporting point of view and send it to Splunk so they can use that as a central repository. And so we have a lot of different ways for administrators to get the data, but I think it's important to note that one of the benefits of isolation is that we're not using signatures to identify bad web traffic from the isolation perspective. We'll use antivirus scanning to scan for documents and payloads and other files and that kind of thing. But from an isolation perspective, we're not applying signatures to a lot of these traffic streams because we're rewriting it. We're stripping out the active content. We're making sure we deliver a secure web stream to the end user's device. So in those cases, customers aren't going to see a lot of alarms, so to speak, for that traffic stream because there aren't any alarms that should go off because we're delivering this clean stream.
But do you know, Nick, it was a website with malware, for example?
Yeah, so what we'll do is, obviously, we have an up-to-date URL categorization system that will kind of continually update and modify as we see new data and apply to that. And so that's where I think the intersection of kind of what do you know versus what are you going to deliver to the user and from a security point of view is relevant. But I think that also speaks to kind of like what I was referring to earlier. If you're going to use isolation for uncategorized websites, you should really be using isolation for every website category that's out there, because you don't know when a website that was good on Monday is going to be bad on Wednesday. You know, websites may get compromised, there may be vulnerabilities, a variety of things may occur that might defy kind of and evade the traditional rules of website categorization. And so you want to apply isolation as broadly as possible. And our platform will give customers the ability to see kind of what the URL categorization breakdown is. And then you can even go further to see kind of what threats were emanating from those particular categories.
Nick, we're actually done with the official part of the show. We have a couple of few open questions, and maybe you have questions to ask. One of the questions I wanted to ask, I am not sure everyone knows what DOM means related to browser. So maybe you can explain for somebody that doesn't know why it's important and what does it mean?
Sure. So the DOM is a document object model that is used in the browser to essentially kind of lay out the blueprint of what needs to go where and what functionality needs to reside within the browser. And that's kind of a very much of a layman's interpretation. Consider it a blueprint for what happens on a web page. And when you're thinking about browser isolation on kind of the most basic end of the spectrum, what a vendor might do is just kind of stream pixels down, basically saying, hey, here's what I see in this browser. I'm just going to recreate that with the colors, the text, and the images on your browser at the endpoint. And that's what introduces a lot of bandwidth consumption, poor usability, and delays and latency. If you're using it at the DOM level, basically what we're able to do is say, it's kind of like, if I wave this hand, I want this hand to wave commensurately. So we're basically mirroring what we see. And all we have to do is tell the DOM what to do at the end user's browser. And that's what gives, a lot of the performance benefits, as well as some of the security benefits, as well as some of the functionality use cases you asked about with respect to browser extensions and so forth. So it's a core component to the functionality, I think, that really customers should explore when they're looking at different isolation vendors, is really get under the hood and understand how they're doing it, because usability is going to be a key issue, and as well as what security policies you can apply is a key issue. And that fundamental approach and decision is really going to be one of the big factors that are relevant here.
Thank you.
There's a couple of things I think are worth kind of mentioning and showing, and probably from a demo perspective here, since I have the share open. The first of which is I want to just go through kind of an example of one of the features that we discussed earlier, this read-only functionality. So this is a live feed from OpenFish, which is publicly available of different links that are considered to be phishing. So I'm just going to pull one here from this link. I'll open it here. It should kind of be somewhat, let's open a new tab here. Now, in this case here, this particular link is basically going through isolation, and it's this website here. It's a phishing attack for this Union Bank site. It looks like they're claiming to be somewhere on the other side of the world. Now, as you'll see in the lower, this is this policy that's applied, read-only restricted, meaning that keyboard input is disabled. And this is where isolation really delivers a ton of value for users, because I can't input my credentials here. I can't allow myself to be phished because it's blocked. Now, this may be something where it says, wow, well, that seems kind of basic. But what we're seeing is phishing is no longer limited to just financial websites. Impersonation overall is extended to a lot of business applications and SaaS platforms, where hackers are basically compromising different SaaS platforms, and then they're able to send share links that might take a user to a URL that looks like a file sharing site or some other collaboration platform. So being able to apply read-only policies to websites based off of risk is a very important functionality. Another piece of functionality that's worth mentioning, and this is one that is extremely relevant today based off of ransomware attacks. Emotet's a good example, where malware and ransomware is being incorporated inside of a password protected zip file. So that means that customers have two options. They can block all zips, or they can let zips through. Now, blocking all zips would create a kind of a rule by exception model. It's like, okay, well, someone really needs this zip. Maybe it's legal, maybe it's finance. Okay, well, hey, I need this zip, send a ticket to IT. IT reviews it. They say, okay, we'll let you through. They'll create a temporary rule, but then they'll retire it. And that might happen hundreds of times, thousands of times a month, creating a lot of friction and drag for administrators. Well, what we can do using isolation is we can render that zip file in isolation. It even goes as far as allowing the user to input the password. So I'll demonstrate that here. So this is a demo page that we use when we're doing customer demos. We have a zip file here that's hosted. I'm going to click to download it here. There we go. It is now being downloaded. As you can see, this is happening in our isolated browser, and we are presenting to the user, hey, here's this file download that's occurring. Do you want to enter the password? Because this file is encrypted. So what we'll do is we'll enter the password. Make sure I enter it correctly. Click submit. And now this, basically what's happening is this file is being rendered on our surrogate browser. And as you'll see here, it's being scanned for risky content. And so this is basically the manifest of the content inside this particular file. And you see content scan is completed. If I wanted to download, I could download this original content, or the administrator could say, hey, don't ever allow it to be downloaded, but you can then open it and kind of render it in kind of an isolated session. And so this is the type of functionality that I think some of the more advanced isolation vendors provide or should be providing. We're one of the few that support this. We might be the only one that support this. And again, this is about providing isolation as a tool to provide for security outcomes that are relevant to today's market. Isolation can't just be about supporting security from browser exploits. It has to be one step further, where you can provide for isolation across as many URL categories as possible, apply it to as much content as possible to really leverage the best of what security can provide today using advanced browser functionality as well as cloud computing. And this is what we're able to do for customers who partner with Menlo to provide this service along their journey to better security outcomes and digital transformation.
Nick, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. A lot of good insights. Very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, Evgeny. I love the show. Looking forward to meeting with you guys again.
Please remember to subscribe to our podcast and join us for our next episode.